If you look around right now, you see the Bakeland legacy everywhere. Plastic is the skin of the modern world, a material of infinite utility. It began with Leo Baekeland, a poor shoemaker son from Belgium, who arrived in America with nothing but debt and a brilliant mind. He became the alchemist of the artificial, turning chemicals into gold and launching the plastic age. His invention birthed a dynasty of unimaginable wealth, where his descendants lived as jet-set royalty, dripping in diamonds, and dining with Salvador Dali. But the glossy surface was a lie. The fortune eventually fell into the hands of Barbara Baekeland, a dazzling socialite whose mind was rotting with hysteria. To cure her son of homosexuality, she didn't buy him therapy, she bought him prostitutes. And when that failed, she crossed the ultimate taboo, taking her own son into her bed, proving that the family built on plastic was destined to suffocate in it. The origin of the Bakeland tragedy lies in the soot-stained streets of Ghent, Belgium, in the late 19th century. Leo Henricus Arthur Baekeland was born in 1863, not into the aristocracy, but into the grinding reality of the working class. His father was an illiterate cobbler who viewed education as a vanity, a distraction from the honest labor of mending shoes. Yet, Leo possessed a mind that operated on a different frequency. He was a prodigy of chemistry, a young man who looked at the natural world and saw only raw materials waiting to be rearranged. By the age of 21, he had defied his father and the rigid class structure of Europe to earn a doctorate, graduating maxima cum laude. He was brilliant, ambitious, and possessed a hunger that could not be sated by the stagnant air of the old world. However, the foundation of the Bakeland Empire was not built solely on genius. It was built on a desperate escape. The sanitized corporate histories often omit the fact that when Leo Baekeland boarded the ship to America in 1889, he was running away from a financial crater. His first business venture in Belgium had collapsed, leaving him with a staggering debt of over 108,000 francs and 58 angry creditors breathing down his neck. This initial failure instilled in him a permanent, low-level paranoia about financial ruin. He arrived in New York not just as an immigrant seeking opportunity, but as a man hunted by his own past, determined to build a fortress of wealth that no creditor could ever breach again. America in the Gilded Age was the perfect laboratory for his ambition. Leo's first major strike was a triumph of photochemistry. He invented Velox, a revolutionary photographic paper that could be developed under artificial gaslight, freeing photographers from their dependence on the sun. It was a product that democratized memory, allowing moments to be captured and processed with unprecedented ease. In 1899, George Eastman, the titan behind Kodak, recognized the threat and the opportunity. He invited Leo to Rochester and purchased the rights to Velox for a sum that stopped the heart, $1 million. In modern currency, this was a fortune of roughly $30 million. Overnight, the cobbler's son had become one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He purchased a grand estate in Yonkers, New York, named the Anchorage, a sprawling property that signaled his arrival into the American elite. But Leo Baekeland was not interested in retirement. He was obsessed with the idea of creation. He retreated into his home laboratory, a place of pungent chemical smells and high-pressure steam, searching for something elusive, a synthetic substitute for shellac. What he found in 1907 changed the course of human history. By controlling the reaction between phenol and formaldehyde under immense heat and pressure, Leo created a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was hard, insoluble, non-conductive, and moldable. He named it Bakelite. Bakelite was the world's first truly synthetic plastic. It was the material of the future. It did not melt, it did not burn. It could be shaped into telephones, radios, car parts, jewelry, and billiard balls. It was the material of 1,000 uses. Leo Baekeland had effectively become a modern alchemist. He had turned industrial sludge into a substance more valuable than ivory. When he established the General Bakelite Company in 1910, he wasn't just starting a business. He was initiating the plastic age. The royalties flowed in like a tidal wave, transforming the Baekeland family from merely rich to dynastic. Yet as the bank accounts swelled, the core personality of Leo Baekeland began to warp. The brilliance that allowed him to manipulate molecules came with a heavy psychological tax. He did not embrace the high society that his money unlocked. Instead, he recoiled from it. The trauma of his early poverty and the pressure of his intellect turned him into an eccentric recluse. At the Anchorage, and later at his Florida estate Snug Rock, Leo lived a life of aggressive simplicity that bordered on performance art. He wore cheap, fraying clothes and shoes that he repaired himself, a phantom habit from his cobbler father. He ate food from cans. He became obsessed with security, patrolling his grounds and treating strangers with deep suspicion. The chemicals he inhaled for decades, phenol and formaldehyde, are known neurotoxins, and while no medical record confirms it, forensic historians speculate that chronic exposure may have calcified his paranoia. He became a ghost in his own mansion, a man who preferred the company of his retorts and beakers to that of his wife and children. He was emotionally distant, viewing his family through the same analytical lens he used for his experiments. He saw his children not as individuals to be nurtured, but as variables in a complex equation that was destined to fail. Leo Baekeland possessed a terrifying prescience regarding the corrosive nature of inherited wealth. He looked at his peers, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and saw how their fortunes had infantilized their offspring. He wrote extensively and bitterly about the dangers of the leisure class. He warned that giving vast sums of money to children who had never worked for it would result in their moral and intellectual atrophy. He predicted that his fortune would be a curse, a solvent that would dissolve the ambition and character of his descendants just as surely as acid dissolves metal. This cynicism created a cold, sterile environment for his son, George Washington Baekeland, and eventually his grandson, Brooks. They grew up in the shadow of a giant who viewed them as prospective failures. Leo did not hide his disdain for the soft life they led, a life he had provided but secretly despised. He was the architect of a paradox. He worked himself to the bone to build an empire, yet he hated the inevitable outcome of that empire, a generation of idle heirs. By the late 1930s, as the sale of his company to Union Carbide for $16.5 million loomed, Leo Baekeland had solidified the family's financial destiny, but he had also set the psychological trap. He had proven that one could master the physical world, bending molecules to one's will, while completely failing to master the human one. He was a King Midas of the industrial age, turning everything he touched into plastic, including the souls of the people who bore his name. The plastic age had begun, and with it, the artificiality that would seep into the marrow of the Bakeland bloodline, preparing the stage for the emptiness that would consume the next generation. The calcification of Leo Baekeland's soul did not happen in a singular dramatic fracture, but rather through a slow, agonizing process of hardening that mirrored the very chemical reactions he had mastered in his laboratory. As the royalties from Bakelite began to pour in, granting him the kind of limitless sovereign wealth that typically unlocks the doors to the highest echelons of the American aristocracy, Leo slammed those doors shut and bolted them from the inside. The money, which should have been a tool for liberation, instead functioned as the mortar for a fortress he constructed around his own psyche, transforming the visionary inventor into a prisoner of his own success. The man who had given the world a material that was practically indestructible was himself becoming brittle, his humanity eroding as his bank account expanded. The visible deterioration of his social capability began at the Anchorage, his sprawling estate in Yonkers, New York. To the outside observer, the property was a symbol of the American dream achieved, a mansion befitting a tycoon who had conquered the industrial age. To Leo, however, domesticity was a distraction from the only reality that made sense to him: chemistry. He treated the mansion not as a home, but as a larger, more expensive laboratory with bedrooms attached. He filled the basement with heavy industrial equipment, turning the foundation of his family life into a factory floor. The air in the house was permanently thick with the stinging medicinal scent of formaldehyde and phenol, a toxic perfume that permeated the drapery and the clothing of his children. He preferred the company of these noxious fumes to human interaction, finding comfort in the predictable stoic reactions of molecules rather than the messy, unpredictable, and often disappointing nature of people. But even the vast wooded grounds of Yonkers proved too crowded, too exposed to the prying eyes of a world he increasingly distrusted. In his final decades, Leo executed a strategic and permanent retreat to Snug Rock, a secluded estate in Coconut Grove, Florida. This property became the physical manifestation of his mental state, isolated, overgrown, and aggressively fortified against a society he viewed as parasitic. Here, amidst the humidity and the mangroves, he ceased to be the father of plastic and fully morphed into the hermit of the grove, a figure of local legend and private terror. His behavior descended into a performative eccentricity that baffled his contemporaries and traumatized his family. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in the Western Hemisphere, Leo Baekeland began to dress with the affectation of a vagrant, a visual rejection of his status that was both deliberate and pathological. He developed a profound aversion to purchasing new clothes, viewing fashion as a frivolous waste of resources and a trap for the vain. He was frequently spotted wandering the perimeter of his estate wearing trousers that were falling apart at the seams, held up not by a leather belt, but by a piece of frayed rope he had scavenged from his workshop. On his feet, he wore canvas shoes that he refused to replace, repairing the holes himself with layers of his own adhesive inventions, turning his footwear into a patchwork of rubber and resin. This was not merely frugality, nor was it the harmless quirk of an old man. It was a forensic marker of a mind that had detached from the social contract. He looked at the trappings of wealth, the tailored suits, the limousines, the country clubs, and saw them as weaknesses, soft layers that dulled the survival instinct he had honed in the poverty of Ghent. He seemed determined to prove that he needed nothing from the world he had helped build, rejecting the consumerism that his own invention had fueled. His diet mirrored his wardrobe in its aggressive simplicity and isolationist logic. The man who could afford private chefs and the finest cuisine from Paris or New York chose to subsist on a survivalist diet that would have been bleak even for a soldier on the front lines. He ate vast quantities of canned Campbell's soup, crackers, and fruit. He grew on his own land. He became obsessed with self-sufficiency to a degree that bordered on mania. He brewed his own wine in the bathtub of the estate, a concoction described by the few unfortunate guests who were forced to taste it as barely drinkable vinegar. This obsession was not about taste, it was about control. It was rooted in a deep-seated, gnawing suspicion that the outside world was trying to poison him, rob him, or exploit him. Every can of soup he opened was a victory against a world he believed was out to get him. Every bottle of wine he bought from a store was a potential risk he refused to take. Paranoia became the dominant frequency of his existence, a static noise that drowned out all affection. Leo installed complex alarm systems around Snug Rock long before such security measures were common for private residences. He patrolled the grounds at odd hours, often armed with a revolver, convinced that competitors were trying to steal his formulas or that kidnappers were targeting his family. While the fear of kidnapping was not entirely baseless in the era following the Lindbergh baby tragedy, in Leo, it metastasized into a delusional fixation. He saw threats where there were none. He alienated friends, business partners, and neighbors, treating a handshake as a potential assault and a compliment as a prelude to theft. He viewed the human race not as a community, but as a collection of potential liabilities. The psychological impact of this behavior on his domestic life was devastating, particularly for his wife Celine. A brilliant woman in her own right, the daughter of his university mentor, she had supported him through the lean years in Belgium and the early struggles in America. But as the fortune grew, she found herself living with a stranger. Leo drifted away from her, not physically but emotionally, retreating into a silo of silence. He locked himself in his study for days, communicating only in grunts or curt instructions. He became a ghost haunting his own dining room, a silent, brooding presence that sucked the oxygen out of the house. The partnership that had built the empire dissolved into a lonely coexistence, where Celine managed the social facade while Leo prowled the grounds, guarding a treasure he no longer knew how to enjoy. But the most critical structural damage, the damage that would doom the dynasty, was inflicted on the genetic line. Modern psychologists reviewing Leo Baekeland's letters, diaries, and recorded behaviors suggest he likely suffered from schizoid personality disorder or a severe form of avoidant personality disorder. These conditions are characterized by a lack of interest in social relationships, a tendency towards a solitary lifestyle, emotional coldness, and detachment. Crucially, current medical understanding suggests that the predisposition for these traits can be hereditary. The eccentricity of the genius was not just a quirk to be laughed at. It was a dormant virus in the bloodline. Leo's inability to connect, his intense suspicion, and his retreat from reality were traits that would bypass his son, George Washington Baekeland, in their rawest form, only to re-emerge with terrifying violence in his great-grandson, Tony. The mental illness that would later claim the life of Barbara Baekeland did not start in a vacuum, nor did it begin in the swinging 60s. It started here, in the silence of Snug Rock, with an old man in ragged clothes pacing the halls of a mansion, checking the locks for the 10th time that night, terrified of the world outside. Leo's parenting style was an extension of his laboratory methods, clinical, demanding, and ultimately cold. He viewed his son George and daughter Nina not as children to be nurtured, but as variables in an experiment that was failing. He was hypercritical, projecting his own fears of failure onto them. He terrorized them with long, bitter lectures on the evils of money, instilling in them a deep sense of guilt about their own privilege. He effectively taught them that the world was dangerous, that other people were parasites, and that emotions were a liability that clouded judgment. He was particularly hard on his son George. Leo wanted George to be a scientist, a grinder, a man of the earth like himself. But George, raised in the comfort Leo provided, lacked the desperate hunger of the immigrant. Leo viewed this lack of hunger as a moral failing, a defect in character. He looked at his son and saw the softness he despised. This rejection created a wound in George Baekeland, a sense of inadequacy and a desire to escape his father's shadow that led him to withdraw into a life of quiet, gentlemanly leisure. George became a passive carrier of the family trauma. He didn't explode like Leo, but he didn't connect either. He simply existed, floating on the raft of money Leo had built, unable to steer and unwilling to paddle. By the time Leo Baekeland finally succumbed to a cerebral hemorrhage in 1944, the damage was calcified. He had secured the family fortune, selling his company to Union Carbide for nearly $16.5 million, cementing the Baekelands as American royalty. But he had hollowed out the family soul. He left behind a legacy of isolation. He taught his descendants that wealth was a fortress to hide inside, not a tool to engage with the world. He validated the idea that genius justifies cruelty, and that if you are rich enough, you don't have to be human. The hermit of Snug Rock is often romanticized in business schools as a quirky, focused genius. But the forensic reality is that he was the architect of the family's doom. He conquered the molecular world, bending the polymers to his will, but he was defeated by the human one. He spent his final years surrounded by millions of dollars, yet lived in a poverty of spirit so profound that it set the stage for the moral bankruptcy of the next generation. The plastic he invented was durable, heat-resistant, and practically indestructible. The family he built was brittle, fracturing under the weight of the silence he imposed upon them. The shadow of the grandfather was long, dark, and toxic, and his grandson, Brooks Baekeland, was about to step right into the middle of it, armed with nothing but money, a profound sense of uselessness, and a genetic time bomb ticking in his DNA. If Leo Baekeland was the blazing sun that generated the gravitational pull of the dynasty, his grandson, Brooks Baekeland, was the black hole that swallowed all the light. By the time the immense fortune descended to the third generation, the Baekeland curse that Leo had prophesied in his bitter ink-stained letters had fully metastasized. The grit of the Belgian shoemaker, the hunger of the immigrant, and the obsessive manic focus of the scientist had been completely filtered out of the bloodline. What remained was a man who possessed every advantage the material world could offer: stunning movie star good looks, a high intellect, and unlimited resources, yet lacked the single essential component necessary for a meaningful human existence, a purpose. Brooks Baekeland, born in 1916, was the forensic archetype of the trust fund baby before the term had even entered the cultural lexicon. He was a man suspended in the golden amber of his grandfather's money, preserved in a state of permanent adolescence. While Leo had spent his life battling creditors, inhaling toxic fumes, and risking his sanity to build something from nothing, Brooks spent his life battling a far more insidious and elusive enemy: boredom. The fortune generated by Bakelite meant that Brooks never had to work a day in his life. He never had to worry about rent, never had to tolerate a demanding boss, never had to sacrifice his desires for survival, and never had to face the consequences of failure. This absolute freedom, rather than liberating him, dismantled his character. It stripped him of the friction that shapes a human soul, leaving him smooth, polished, and utterly hollow. Forensic psychologists often refer to this condition as affluenza, but in the case of Brooks, it was more akin to a spiritual paralysis. He drifted through life with the detached elegance of a tourist in his own existence. He enrolled at Columbia University to study physics, hinting at a potential inheritance of his grandfather's scientific mind, but he lacked the discipline to finish the degree. Why study the laws of thermodynamics when you can pay someone else to understand them for you? He dropped out not because he lacked the intelligence. By all accounts, he was intellectually brilliant and widely read, but because the effort required to succeed seemed pedestrian compared to the ease of his bank account. To strive for something was to admit you needed it, and Brooks Baekeland needed nothing. Instead of a career, Brooks adopted the persona of the gentleman scholar and the bon vivant. He fancied himself a writer, a philosopher, and a traveler, styling himself after the brooding heroes of F. Scott Fitzgerald novels, a tragic figure of the Jazz Age surviving awkwardly into the Cold War. He wrote prose that was technically proficient but emotionally hollow, much like the man himself. He spent years working on a book titled The Art of Conversation, a painfully ironic project for a man who used words primarily as weapons to keep people at a distance or to dismantle their self-esteem. The manuscript, like almost everything else in his life, remained an unfinished testament to his lack of follow-through. He was a collector of experiences, but he felt none of them deeply. The tragedy of Brooks Baekeland was that he was acutely, painfully aware of his own uselessness. He was not a fool who believed his own hype. He was a cynic who saw through everything, including himself. He looked at the world with a sneering superiority, judging everyone around him while secretly despising himself for achieving nothing of substance. He viewed his grandfather Leo not with reverence, but with a complex mixture of resentment and awe. Leo was the giant who had cast the shadow. Brooks was merely the vegetation that grew, pale and weak in the darkness beneath. This internalized self-loathing manifested as a profound icy coldness. Brooks became a man who was incapable of genuine empathy. He treated emotions as vulgarities, weaknesses to be dissected and mocked. He was the Iceman of the New York social scene, a man who could charm a room with his wit, but would not walk across the street to help a friend in need. It was into this vacuum of personality that he dragged Barbara Daly. The meeting between Brooks Baekeland and Barbara Daly in the early 1940s was a collision of matter and antimatter. If Brooks was the embodiment of old money stagnation, repressed, polite, and dead inside, Barbara was the explosion of new ambition. She was everything he was not and everything his family feared. Barbara Daly was a force of nature, born in Boston to a middle-class family with a dark history of mental instability. She had clawed her way into the glittering world of New York through sheer force of will and stunning beauty. She was a model who had graced the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She was an aspiring actress who had tasted the fringes of Hollywood. She was vibrant, loud, emotional, and devastatingly charismatic. She possessed a hunger that Brooks had never known. She wanted to be someone. She wanted to be seen. To Brooks, Barbara was an exotic specimen. He was attracted to her vitality in the way a vampire is attracted to a pulse. She offered him a break from the suffocating boredom of his patrician circle. She was dangerous. She was socially inferior in the rigid hierarchy of the Bakeland clan, a commoner with a modeling portfolio and a Boston accent. And marrying her was an act of passive-aggressive rebellion against the ghosts of his ancestors. It was a way for Brooks to shock the polite society he secretly hated. For Barbara, Brooks was the prize. He was the golden ticket. He was the name, the money, and the status she had spent her entire life chasing. She looked at him and saw security. She didn't see the emptiness behind his eyes. She believed that with her energy and his money, they could conquer the world. She believed she could fix him, warm him up, and turn him into the great man his grandfather was. She didn't realize she was marrying a mirror that would only reflect her own insecurities back at her. magnified. They married in California in 1942, creating one of the most glamorous and toxic couples of the era. They were the golden couple of the international jet set. They were beautiful, wealthy, and seemingly perfect. But forensic analysis of their marriage reveals that the foundation was rotten from day one. The union was fueled not by love, but by alcohol and mutual destruction. The Baekelands did not have jobs, they had cocktail hour. They moved through the capitals of Europe, Paris, London, Rome, and eventually the Spanish coast, like a traveling circus of dysfunction. They held court in the finest restaurants, surrounded by artists, writers, and sycophants. They were friends with the literary elite, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, and James Jones. But behind the closed doors of their luxury suites, the war began. Brooks, with his cruel intellect, delighted in deconstructing Barbara. He mocked her intelligence. He belittled her middle-class origins. He corrected her grammar in front of guests. He treated her not as a wife, but as a project that had failed to meet his exacting standards. He used his silence as a weapon, freezing her out for days, driving her into hysterical fits of desperation. He withheld affection as a form of discipline. Barbara, in turn, fought back with the only weapon she had, drama and instability. She drank heavily to numb the pain of his rejection. She threw tantrums that became legendary in their social circle. She staged suicide attempts, swallowing pills, cutting her wrists, not necessarily to die, but to get a reaction from the stone statue she had married. She wanted him to feel something, even if it was anger. But Brooks would often just watch her with clinical detachment, perhaps lighting a cigarette, waiting for the performance to end so he could go back to his reading. This dynamic created a shared psychosis that hermetically sealed them off from reality. They were addicted to each other's toxicity. They enabled each other's worst instincts. Brooks provided the money that funded Barbara's alcoholism. Barbara provided the drama that alleviated Brooks's boredom. They were trapped in a cycle of abuse that was glamorized by their wealth. The world looked at them and saw a fairy tale. The reality was, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, played out on a limitless budget with no exit strategy. The tragedy deepened with the realization that Brooks Baekeland was a man who should never have been a father. When their son, Anthony, was born in 1946, Brooks viewed the child not as a blessing, but as an intruder. He saw Tony as a rival for Barbara's attention. He saw the boy's neediness as weakness. Brooks was incapable of nurturing. He approached fatherhood with the same cold incompetence he approached his career. He was physically present, but emotionally absent, a ghost hovering in the background of Tony's life, judging, criticizing, and ignoring. Brooks's uselessness was the soil in which the family's madness grew. Because he had no purpose, he had no anchor. He dragged his wife and child across the globe, moving from hotel to rented villa, never staying in one place long enough for Tony to make friends or find stability. They were global nomads before the term existed, but their movement was a flight from themselves. Brooks was running away from the realization that he was a fraud, and in doing so, he turned his family into collateral damage. As the years wore on, the glamour began to fade, revealing the ugliness underneath. The money allowed them to hide the decay for a long time. They could always buy a new car, rent a new chateau, or fly to a new island. But the forensic truth remains. Brooks Baekeland murdered his family long before any knife was picked up. He murdered them with neglect. He murdered them with apathy. He created a vacuum of love and purpose so profound that it eventually sucked his wife and son into a vortex of insanity. He was the pilot of a plane that was in a slow, comfortable nosedive, and he was too busy mixing a martini to pull up. He watched his wife disintegrate and his son detach from reality, and he did nothing, because doing something would have required caring. And Brooks Bakeland had long ago decided that caring was for people who couldn't afford not to. If Brooks Bakeland was the cold, unmoving void at the center of the family, his wife, Barbara Daly Bakeland, was the chaotic storm system that swirled around him, destroying everything in its path in a desperate attempt to feel alive. To the outside world, framed through the lenses of society photographers in Paris, London, and the Costa Brava, Barbara was the epitome of the mid-century American goddess. She was the Cinderella story come to life, the girl from the wrong side of the tracks in Boston who had ascended to the very peak of the international aristocracy. She was stunningly beautiful, with a bone structure that caught the light like a diamond and a laugh that could fill a ballroom. But forensic psychology paints a portrait of a woman who was not living a dream, but surviving a nightmare of her own making. Barbara was not just a socialite, she was a predator of affection, a woman with a hole in her soul so vast that she eventually tried to fill it with her own son. The tragedy of Barbara Daly lies in the dissonance between her public image and her private reality. She had achieved the impossible. She had married into the Bakeland fortune. She had the jewels, the chateaus, and the dinner parties with Salvador Dali and Greta Garbo. Yet she was plagued by a terminal case of imposter syndrome. Deep down, she remained the insecure girl from Boston whose father had committed suicide, the girl who was terrified that at any moment the old money elites would realize she didn't belong and cast her out. This insecurity drove her to a state of manic perfectionism. She curated her life like a museum exhibit. Every dinner party had to be legendary. Every outfit had to be haute couture. Every conversation had to be sparkling. She was exhausted by the effort of being Barbara Bakeland, but she was terrified of stopping, because stopping meant facing the silence of her husband. The marriage to Brooks, which had begun as a passionate collision of opposites, had degenerated into a blood sport. By the 1950s, the Baekelands were known in the jet set not just for their glamour, but for their violence. They were the beautiful and damned of their generation. Alcohol was the fuel for their mutual destruction. They drank with the professional dedication of the lost generation, martinis at lunch, wine at dinner, whiskey until dawn. Under the influence, the veneer of civilization cracked. Their fights were operatic. Guests at their rented villas would often hear the sounds of crashing glass, screaming, and physical blows echoing from the master bedroom. Barbara, desperate for a reaction from her Iceman husband, would hurl lamps, vases, and insults. She would scratch his face. He would drag her across the floor by her hair. The next morning they would emerge for lunch on the terrace wearing sunglasses to hide the bruises, acting as if nothing had happened. This was the mechanism of their bond, a cycle of violence and repression that normalized chaos. And sitting quietly at the breakfast table, watching this grotesque performance, was the audience of one, their son, Anthony. If Barbara was the predator of emotion, Tony was the prey. From the moment he was born in 1946, Tony was not allowed to be a child. To Barbara, he was a possession, an accessory, and a savior. Brooks had rejected her emotionally, retreating into his books and his travels. So Barbara turned the full blinding spotlight of her neediness onto her son. She called him her golden boy, her petit prince. She did not raise him. She seduced him into a state of permanent dependency. Forensic psychiatrists identify this dynamic as covert incest or emotional incest. It does not necessarily involve physical contact in the early stages, but it involves a violation of boundaries that is just as damaging. Barbara treated Tony as her confidant, her partner, and her emotional spouse. She told him about her marital problems. She cried on his shoulder when Brooks was cruel to her. She entangled him in the intricate web of her adult suffering. She made Tony feel responsible for her happiness. If Tony was good, meaning attentive, adoring, and compliant, Mommy was happy. If Tony wanted independence, Mommy would crumble into a suicidal depression. This suffocation was disguised as extreme love. Barbara was obsessed with Tony's beauty. He was an angelic child, inheriting the best features of both parents, and Barbara paraded him through the salons of Europe like a prize poodle. She controlled every aspect of his life. She chose his clothes, his friends, and his hobbies. She dragged him out of schools whenever the family decided to move, ensuring that he never formed bonds with peers his own age. His only friend was his mother. She created a hermetically sealed world where it was just Tony and Barbara against the world. As Tony entered adolescence, the dynamic shifted from suffocating to sinister. The prince was growing up, and he was becoming a stunningly attractive young man. In a normal family, this is the time when a mother steps back to allow her son to find his own path. Barbara Baekeland did the opposite. She tightened her grip. She became jealous of anyone who drew Tony's attention away from her. The backdrop for this unfolding tragedy was a lifestyle of decadent aimlessness. The family bounced between Paris, the Italian Riviera, and the wild artistic community of Cadaqués in Spain. It was a world of surrealists, bohemians, and aristocrats where traditional morality was viewed as a bourgeois affliction. In this environment, boundaries were fluid. Tony was exposed to adult sexuality, drug use, and erratic behavior from a very young age. He was a prop at Barbara's dinner parties, expected to charm the guests, mix the drinks, and listen to the gossip. He was trained to be a diplomat in a war zone, constantly managing his mother's moods and his father's disdain. Brooks Bakeland watched this unhealthy enmeshment with a mixture of disgust and relief. On one hand, he viewed Tony as soft, a mama's boy who lacked the masculine grit Brooks pretended to value. He mocked Tony's artistic, sensitive nature, calling him weak. On the other hand, Tony's presence distracted Barbara. As long as Barbara was obsessing over Tony, she wasn't bothering Brooks. He essentially abdicated his role as a father, handing his son over to be consumed by his wife's neuroses. Brooks was the silent accomplice to the psychological abuse. He saw the way Barbara touched Tony, the way she looked at him, the way she kept him in her bed during thunderstorms long after he was too old for it. And he did nothing. He simply poured another drink and looked away. By the mid-1960s, the golden boy began to crack. Tony started to exhibit signs of the mental illness that had plagued his great-grandfather Leo and his maternal grandfather. He had episodes of dissociation. He struggled with his identity. He was a young man with no skills, no education, no career, and no sense of self outside of his mother's reflection. He was a trust fund kid like his father, but without the cynicism to protect him. He was raw, exposed, and fragile. Barbara, terrified by these cracks, did not seek professional help. To her, psychiatrists were for crazy people, and admitting her son was imperfect would damage her social standing. Instead, she doubled down on her control. She convinced herself that Tony just needed more love, more attention, and more Barbara. She began to sabotage his attempts at independence. When he expressed an interest in painting, she criticized his work while simultaneously praising his genius to others, creating a confusing double-bind. When he tried to date girls, she ridiculed them, finding flaws in their appearance or their lineage, ensuring that no woman could ever compete with her. The ambition of Barbara Baekeland had mutated. It was no longer about climbing the social ladder. She had already reached the top. Her ambition was now singular and terrifying. Total possession. She wanted to own Tony completely. She wanted to be the only woman in his life, the only voice in his head. She was like a drowning woman clutching a life raft, unaware that she was pulling the raft down with her. The turning point came as the swinging 60s exploded around them. The culture was shifting towards sexual liberation, psychedelics, and rebellion. Tony naturally was drawn to this new world. He wanted to explore his sexuality, his mind, and his freedom. Barbara, sensing him slipping away, panicked. She realized that her beauty, her primary currency, was fading. She saw Brooks drifting towards younger women. She felt the cold wind of irrelevance blowing through her life, and she looked at Tony, young, beautiful, and malleable, and made a decision that crossed the final line of maternal sanity. She decided that if she couldn't keep him as a son, she would keep him as something else. The predator was about to stop hunting for status and start hunting for a mate, and the target was living in the bedroom down the hall. By the late 1960s, the Baekeland family had drifted far from the industrious, soot-stained reality of the grandfather's laboratory, and had entered a realm of high-gloss surrealism, where the laws of morality were suspended. The family fortune, generated by the hard, durable utility of Bakelite plastic, was now funding a life of soft, rotting luxury. At the center of this decay was Anthony Baekeland, the heir apparent to the dynasty. In his early 20s, Tony was physically a masterpiece, a golden-haired, angelic young man who possessed the kind of fragile, ethereal beauty that painters like Botticelli would have immortalized. But forensically, he was a ruin. The mechanism of his destruction was not a chemical addiction or a financial collapse. It was the systematic obliteration of his psyche by the two people tasked with protecting him. Tony was a young man constructed entirely of other people's projections. To his father Brooks, he was a disappointment, a soft failure who lacked the masculine drive to conquer the world. To his mother Barbara, he was a surrogate husband, a best friend, and a living doll to be dressed, adored, and possessed. Tony had no self. He had been raised in the hermetic bubble of the jet set, moving from hotel to hotel, never attending a school long enough to learn how to interact with reality. He spoke multiple languages fluently, but could not hold a job. He could order wine in impeccable French, but could not navigate the basic emotional landscape of adulthood. As he entered his 20s, the cracks in the porcelain began to widen into fissures. Tony began to exhibit the classic, terrifying symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. It started quietly, a gaze that lingered too long on empty space, a sentence that trailed off into word salad, a sudden violent outburst followed by hours of catatonic silence. He began to hear voices, whispers, that told him he was being watched, that he was in danger, that his parents were plotting against him. In a cruel twist of genetics, the paranoia that had driven his great-grandfather Leo to patrol the grounds of Snug Rock with a gun had skipped 2 generations to manifest in Tony, but without the intellect to channel it. Leo had used his paranoia to protect his patents. Tony was drowning in his. A responsible family would have sought the best psychiatric care money could buy. But the Baekelands were not a responsible family. They were an image-conscious aristocracy. Barbara Daly Baekeland viewed mental illness as a bourgeois embarrassment, a stain on the perfection she had curated. She refused to admit her golden boy was sick. Instead, she diagnosed him herself. She decided that Tony wasn't mentally ill, he was just sensitive, artistic, and sexually confused. This misdiagnosis led to the incestuous hook, the darkest and most controversial chapter of the family saga. During his adolescence, Tony began to explore his sexuality. He gravitated towards men. In the bohemian circles of Paris and Cadiquet, homosexuality was tolerated. But to Barbara, a woman whose entire identity was built on her ability to seduce and control men, her son's homosexuality was a personal insult. She viewed it not as an orientation, but as a rejection of her. If Tony loved men, it meant he didn't need a woman, and if he didn't need a woman, he didn't need his mother. Barbara decided to cure him. The therapy she devised was a grotesque violation of maternal boundaries. It began with procurement. Barbara, the socialite hostess, began to act as a pimp for her own son. She would scout for beautiful young women at parties, models, actresses, drifters, and invite them back to the Bakeland apartment. She would push them into Tony's bedroom, literally closing the door on them, demanding that her son perform. When these arrangements failed, because Tony was either uninterested or terrified, Barbara escalated. She began hiring professional prostitutes. She would pay women to have sex with her son while she waited in the next room, treating the act like a medical procedure she was supervising. When the prostitutes failed to fix him, the dynamic shifted from coercion to direct intervention. The forensic record here becomes a haze of rumors, confessions, and horrifying implications. But the consensus among biographers and witnesses is that the ultimate taboo was broken. Barbara Baekeland, in a state of narcissistic desperation and alcoholic delirium, decided that she was the only woman who could truly satisfy her son. She believed that only she knew him, only she loved him, and only she could save him from the deviance of homosexuality. Whether the incest was fully consummated or remained a relentless atmosphere of emotional and sexual coercion is almost irrelevant to the psychological outcome. The damage was absolute. Barbara dissolved the wall between mother and child. She walked around the apartment nude. She climbed into his bed to comfort him during his schizophrenic episodes. She manipulated him with jealousy, flirting with his male friends to make Tony compete for her attention. She created a psychosexual whirlpool that sucked Tony down into a confusion so profound that he could no longer distinguish between love, hate, sex, and violence. He was trapped in a double bind. He was terrified of his mother's smothering sexuality, yet he was completely dependent on her for his survival. While Barbara was consuming Tony, Brooks Baekeland delivered the final blow that shattered what little reality Tony had left. By 1968, the toxic marriage between Brooks and Barbara had finally imploded. Brooks wanted out, but he didn't just leave. He executed a betrayal of Shakespearean cruelty. During this period, Tony had managed to form a relationship with a woman named Sylvie. She was one of the few women Tony actually connected with, a lifeline to a normal heterosexual existence that Barbara had demanded. Sylvie was Tony's hope. Brooks Baekeland looked at his son's girlfriend and saw an opportunity to escape his wife. In a move of breathtaking callousness, Brooks seduced Sylvie. He stole his son's girlfriend. The impact of this cannot be overstated. Tony was already struggling with his masculinity, his sexuality, and his sanity. To have his father, the distant, judgmental patriarch, swoop in and take the one woman he cared for was a psychological castration. It confirmed everything the voices in Tony's head were telling him. You are nothing. You are weak. You are not a man. Your father is the alpha. You are the failure. Brooks ran off with Sylvie, eventually marrying her. He abandoned Barbara and Tony in London, leaving them alone in the wreckage. This was the moment the mechanism of the tragedy locked into place. Brooks removed the buffer. Before, the triangulation between the three of them had diffused the tension. With Brooks gone, Tony and Barbara were left alone in a claustrophobic orbit. There was no one left to intervene, no one to tell Barbara to stop drinking, no one to tell Tony to take his medication. The setting for this final act was a series of luxury apartments in London, most notably the penthouse at 81 Cadogan Square. It was a gilded cage filled with expensive art, Persian rugs, and empty bottles. The atmosphere was thick with a gothic miasma. Barbara slid deeper into alcoholism and depression, terrified of aging, terrified of being alone. She clung to Tony with a death grip. She screamed at him, blamed him for Brooks leaving, and then wept and begged him to hold her. Tony, unmedicated and unraveling, absorbed her rage and her sorrow. His schizophrenia blossomed in the isolation. He began to have violent outbursts. He would disappear into the London fog for days, returning dirty and confused. He talked to people who weren't there. He carried knives. In 1969, a prelude to the murder occurred. Tony tried to throw himself out of a window. Barbara pulled him back. In the ensuing struggle, or perhaps in a separate incident, Tony attacked her. He was arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital, the Priory. This was the family's last chance. The doctors at the Priory saw the severity of Tony's condition. They recommended long-term institutionalization and heavy medication. They warned Barbara that her son was dangerous. But Barbara, ever the narcissist, refused to accept the diagnosis. She viewed the hospital as a prison that was keeping her prince away from her. She checked him out against medical advice. She brought him back to the apartment. She believed her love was stronger than his psychosis. She was wrong. By the winter of 1972, the madness in Silk had reached its terminal velocity. Tony was 26 years old, but mentally he was a terrified child trapped in a man's body. He was living in a state of constant hallucinatory terror. The boundaries of his world had collapsed. His mother was his lover, his tormentor, his jailer, and his God. The tension in the apartment was physical, a static charge building up before a lightning strike. The silk sheets, the velvet curtains, the crystal glasses, all the trappings of the Bakeland fortune were just props on a stage set for a massacre. The plastic money of Leo Baekeland had bought them everything except sanity. And now the bill was coming due. The final act of the Bakeland tragedy played out not in the tropical isolation of the grandfather's Florida estate, nor in the sun-drenched villas of the Mediterranean, where the family had posed for society photographers. It concluded in the gray, suffocating damp of London, inside a penthouse apartment that had become a pressure cooker of aristocratic dysfunction. The date was November 17th, 1972. The location was 81 Cadogan Square in the heart of Chelsea. To the casual observer walking along the street below, the building was a pillar of British respectability, a fortress of red brick and white stucco inhabited by the wealthy and the discreet. But inside the penthouse, the air was thick with a gothic miasma, a toxic fog of stale alcohol, unwashed silk, and impending violence. By the autumn of 1972, the relationship between Barbara Daly Baekeland and her son Tony had devolved into a terminal state of shared psychosis. They were no longer mother and child. They were two drowning swimmers clutching each other in deep water, each pulling the other down. Barbara, devastated by the abandonment of her husband Brooks, had spiraled into a severe depression fueled by gin and pills. She had stopped eating. She had stopped sleeping. Her legendary beauty had dissolved into a gaunt, haggard mask of terror. She was terrified of aging, terrified of poverty, and above all, terrified of being alone. Tony at 26 was a ghost haunting the apartment. His schizophrenia was unmedicated and raging. The voices in his head, which had once been whispers, were now shouting commands. He believed that his mother was conspiring against him. He believed she was trying to steal his soul. He believed that he was not human, but a mechanism being controlled by external forces. The apartment at Cadogan Square had become his cell, and Barbara was the warden who held the keys. The mechanism of the murder was triggered by a mundane domestic dispute that rapidly escalated into existential warfare. The exact catalyst remains a subject of forensic reconstruction, but witnesses and investigators believe it centered on money and freedom. On that Friday afternoon, an argument erupted in the kitchen. The tension had been building for weeks. Tony wanted to leave. He wanted to break free from the suffocating orbit of his mother. He spoke of going to New York, of finding his father, of escaping the gloom of London. Barbara, sensing his detachment, panicked. Her abandonment issues triggered a primal narcissistic rage. She reportedly screamed at him, threatening to cut off his inheritance. She weaponized his incompetence, reminding him that he had no skills, no job, and no ability to survive without her checkbook. She attacked his masculinity, perhaps making a cruel comparison to his father, Brooks, the man who had rejected them both. For a schizophrenic mind teetering on the edge of a break, this verbal assault was not just an argument. It was an annihilation of the self. Tony looked at his mother and likely did not see the woman who raised him. He saw a demon. He saw the predator that had consumed his childhood, the woman who had forced him into her bed, the woman who had pimped him out to strangers, the woman who was now standing between him and his survival. The violence was sudden, intimate, and brutal. Tony grabbed a kitchen knife. It was not a premeditated act of assassination. It was a reactive strike of panic. He lunged at her. Barbara attempted to flee, running from the kitchen into the hallway, but Tony pursued her. He stabbed her repeatedly. The forensic report details multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck. The ferocity of the attack suggests a release of years of repressed rage. It was an attempt to cut the umbilical cord with a blade. Barbara Baekeland collapsed on the floor of the hallway, bleeding out on the expensive carpet. The woman who had clawed her way from the middle class of Boston to the heights of European aristocracy died amidst the wreckage of her own ambition, killed by the golden boy she had tried to possess completely. But it is the immediate aftermath of the murder that elevates this case from a domestic tragedy to a study in forensic horror. In the moments following the death of his mother, Tony Baekeland did not flee the scene. He did not scream for help. He did not attempt to revive her. Instead, his mind executed a hard reset. He entered a state of profound dissociation. The reality of what he had just done was too massive for his fractured psyche to process, so he simply deleted it. He stepped over his mother's body as if it were a piece of furniture and returned to the routine of his evening. He walked to the telephone. He did not call an ambulance. He dialed the number of his favorite Chinese restaurant, likely the Blue Gardenia or a similar local establishment. He ordered dinner. He spoke calmly to the person on the other end of the line. He ordered his usual dishes, perhaps Peking duck or fried rice, specifying the delivery address. He hung up the phone. Only after he had secured his dinner did he dial 999 to call the police. When the operator answered, Tony's voice was devoid of emotion. He did not sound like a man who had just committed matricide. He sounded like a man reporting a broken window. "I've just killed my mother," he reportedly said, his tone flat and conversational. He gave the address and waited. When the police arrived at 81 Cadogan Square, they found a scene that defied logic. The apartment was a tableau of bloody chaos. Barbara's body lay in the hallway, the life drained from her. The air smelled of metallic blood and stale perfume. But in the living room, Tony Baekeland was sitting quietly. Some accounts suggest he was waiting for the Chinese food to arrive. Others suggest the food had already been delivered and he was eating it. Regardless of the precise timing, the psychological implication is the same: the complete detachment of affect. To the forensic psychologist, the Chinese takeout detail is the smoking gun of his insanity. It demonstrates a complete breakdown of moral reasoning and emotional connection. In Tony's mind, the act of killing his mother and the act of eating dinner were events of equal weight. The murder was just a task he had completed, like taking out the trash. The hunger was the only reality left to him. He was a creature of pure, immediate impulse, stripped of the higher-level consciousness that defines humanity. The police arrested him without a struggle. He was docile, compliant, and seemingly relieved. As they led him away in handcuffs, stepping past the corpse of the woman who had dominated every second of his 26 years, Tony looked less like a criminal and more like a sleepwalker. He was finally free of her, but the price of his freedom was his sanity. The investigation that followed revealed the systemic failure of the institutions that were supposed to protect the Baekelands. The detectives discovered that Tony had been a ticking time bomb for years. They found the records from the Priory, the psychiatric hospital where Tony had been treated just months earlier. The doctors there had warned Barbara explicitly, "Do not take him home. He is dangerous. He is capable of violence." Barbara had signed his release papers against medical advice. She had believed that her love was stronger than his psychosis. She had believed that the rules of medicine, like the rules of finance, did not apply to the Bakelands. Her arrogance, her refusal to accept the reality of her son's illness, was the true weapon that killed her. The knife in Tony's hand was merely the instrument. The mechanism of her death was her own denial. The bloody apartment became a grim monument to the plastic curse. The Bakeland fortune, built on the invention of a material that was artificial and indestructible, had produced a reality that was artificial and destructible. The money had shielded Tony from the consequences of his illness for years. It had allowed Barbara to buy her way out of trouble, to move to new cities, to hire lawyers and doctors who would tell her what she wanted to hear. But in the end, the money could not stop the knife. The murder sent a shockwave through the high society circles of London and New York. The friends who had attended Barbara's parties, who had drunk her champagne and gossiped about her son's beauty, were horrified. But forensic analysis of their reactions reveals a deep hypocrisy. Everyone knew. Everyone had seen the bruises, the erratic behavior, the incestuous overtones. They had watched the tragedy unfold in slow motion for decades, but they had done nothing because the Baekelands were rich, entertaining, and generous hosts. The bloody apartment was the final destination of a train that everyone saw leaving the station, but no one tried to stop. Tony was charged with murder, but it was clear to everyone involved that he was unfit to stand trial. He was remanded to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility that houses Britain's most dangerous, criminally insane offenders. There, stripped of his silk suits and his trust fund, the prince became just another patient, screaming at the walls in a padded cell. The dynasty had effectively ended in that pool of blood on the floor of Cadogan Square. The rest was just the long, slow echo of the crash. The sprawling, blood-soaked saga of the Baekeland Dynasty did not end with the arrest of Tony Baekeland in the hallway of 81 Cadogan Square. While the physical act of murder was clear, a son, a knife, a mother, the forensic question of culpability remained a murky, terrifying labyrinth that divided society and psychiatrists alike. In the years following the crime, as Tony languished in the high-security ward of Broadmoor Hospital, a fierce debate erupted in the salons of New York and London. Was Anthony Baekeland a bad seed, a genetic monster born with the instinct to kill? Or was he the ultimate victim, a fragile vessel shattered by the sadistic narcissism of his parents? The suspicious theories regarding the true villain of this tragedy force us to look beyond the knife and examine the hands that spent 26 years sharpening it. The first and perhaps most damning theory points the finger directly at the man who was thousands of miles away when the crime occurred, Brooks Baekeland. To the casual observer, Brooks appears to be a peripheral figure in the murder, the absent father who had simply walked away from a toxic marriage. But a forensic reconstruction of the family timeline suggests that Brooks was not merely a bystander, he was the catalyst. He was the arsonist who poured the gasoline, lit the match, and then left the building before the explosion, claiming he had nothing to do with the fire. The indictment of Brooks centers on the single most destructive act in the family's history, an act so callous that it borders on psychological warfare. By 1968, Tony Baekeland was a young man hanging by a thread. He was battling schizophrenia, grappling with his sexual identity, and suffocating under his mother's incestuous obsession. In this darkness, he found a single ray of light. Sylvie. Sylvie was Tony's girlfriend. She was beautiful, grounded, and crucially, she was his. She represented a bridge to normalcy, a chance for Tony to have an adult relationship outside of the suffocating orbit of his mother. Brooks Baekeland saw this relationship not as a sign of his son's recovery, but as an opportunity for his own gratification. In a move that stunned their social circle, Brooks seduced Sylvie. He didn't just have a clandestine affair, he effectively stole her. He took the one thing that belonged to his son and claimed it for himself. He ran off with her, eventually marrying her and having a child, creating a new family on the ashes of the old one. Psychologically, this was a lethal injection. For a son who already felt inadequate, who had spent his life being told he was soft and useless by his father, having his girlfriend stolen by that same father was a total annihilation of the self. It confirmed Tony's deepest paranoid delusions. My father is the alpha male who destroys me. I am not a man. I am nothing. Proponents of the cruel father theory argue that Brooks knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Tony was fragile. He knew that removing Sylvie would leave Tony alone in the cage with Barbara. He knew that Barbara would descend into alcoholic madness without him. Brooks calculated that by destroying the family dynamic, he could free himself from his responsibilities. He sacrificed his wife and son to secure his own exit. When the news of the murder reached him, Brooks reportedly showed little surprise. He had engineered the collapse. The violence was just the inevitable outcome of the structural failure he had induced. He had weaponized his son's mental illness to kill his marriage, but the weapon had gone off and killed his wife instead. However, the second theory shifts the gaze to the victim herself, Barbara Daly Baekeland. It is uncomfortable to blame a murder victim for their own death, but the Baekeland case is a forensic anomaly. Barbara was not a passive victim. She was an active participant in the creation of her killer. The nurture argument posits that Tony was not born a monster, but was painstakingly groomed into one by a mother who refused to let him exist as a separate entity. This theory relies on the concept of the double bind, a psychological dilemma identified by anthropologist Gregory Bateson, often linked to the development of schizophrenia. Barbara placed Tony in a situation where he could not win. She demanded he be a man, but whenever he tried to be a man, she punished him with guilt, rage, and suicide threats. She demanded he be heterosexual, yet she slept in his bed and seduced his friends. The incestuous hook was the ultimate manifestation of this abuse. By blurring the sexual boundaries, Barbara shattered Tony's understanding of reality. She taught him that love was synonymous with consumption. She didn't want him to be happy. She wanted him to be hers. Witnesses described scenes where Barbara would mock Tony's attempts at independence in front of guests, treating him like a pet that had learned a new trick. She infantilized him to the point of paralysis. When Tony picked up the knife on that November afternoon, the theory suggests he wasn't attacking his mother. He was attacking the suffocating force that was strangling him. It was an act of existential self-defense. In his delusional state, he believed that for him to live, she had to die. There was not enough oxygen in the room for both of them. Barbara had spent 26 years weaving a spider web around her son, and in the end, the fly panicked and tore the web down, taking the spider with it. Then there is the third, and perhaps most chilling theory, the genetic inevitability. This theory looks past the parents and points back to the grandfather, Leo Baekeland. It argues that the tragedy was written in the blood code of the dynasty long before Brooks or Barbara ever met. It suggests that Tony was doomed from conception. The forensic evidence for this lies in the family tree. Leo Baekeland, the genius, was a paranoid recluse with schizoid tendencies. His wife, Celine, suffered from severe depression. Barbara's father committed suicide. There was a history of mental instability on both sides of the genetic equation. When Brooks and Barbara married, they merged two volatile bloodlines. Tony's schizophrenia emerged early and aggressively. Even before the drugs and the trauma, he was described as a strange child, prone to dissociation and violent fantasies. Friends recalled him staring at fires for hours or making impulsive, cruel remarks that seemed to lack empathy. This theory argues that the environment, the money, the travel, the abuse, was merely the scenery. The play was a tragedy written by DNA. Tony's brain was wired for chaos. The chemicals that Leo Baekeland manipulated in his lab were mirrored by the imbalanced chemicals in his great-grandson's brain. No amount of therapy or love could have stopped the train. The brakes were cut before it even left the station. Under this lens, the murder was a biological glitch. The plastic prince was defective. The wealth of the family simply allowed the defect to go untreated for longer than it would have in a poor family. If Tony had been born into poverty, he would have likely been institutionalized in his teens. Because he was a Baekeland, he was allowed to roam free, his illness protected by a wall of money until it became lethal. Finally, there is the societal theory, which indicts the entire culture of the jet-set elite. This perspective views the Baekelands as a symptom of a diseased class system. They lived in a world without consequences. They were moral tourists who treated people like disposables. Brooks used women. Barbara used Tony. Tony used drugs. They were surrounded by enablers, friends like Salvador Dali or aristocrats and hangers-on, who watched the disintegration of the family as a form of entertainment. No one intervened. No one called child services. No one told Barbara to stop. The collective silence of the rich allowed the pressure to build. The murder was the result of affluenza reaching its terminal stage. When people have too much money and zero purpose, they begin to cannibalize themselves. The Baekelands had conquered the material world, but they had no spiritual immune system. They were bored, and in their boredom, they created drama to feel alive. Eventually, the drama required a body count. In the final forensic analysis, looking at the blood on the floor of Cadogan Square, it is impossible to isolate a single monster. Was it Brooks, the cold architect of abandonment? Yes. Was it Barbara, the suffocating predator of love? Yes. Was it the ghost of Leo and the genetic curse of the genius? Yes. Tony Baekeland was a monster, certainly. He stabbed his mother and ordered Chinese food. But he was a monster manufactured on an assembly line. The raw materials were provided by his grandfather, the structural engineering was done by his father, and the finishing touches were applied by his mother. He was the final product of the Baekeland Empire, a perfect, beautiful, lethal machine that had no function other than to destroy its creators. As Tony sat in Broadmoor, medicated into a stupor, the world outside moved on. Brooks Baekeland lived his life with his new wife, rarely speaking of the son he had destroyed. The Baekeland fortune continued to generate dividends, but the suspicious theories lingered like the smell of phenol, a reminder that in the alchemy of this family, gold had been successfully transmuted into blood. The murder of Barbara Daly Baekeland in 1972 should have been the final bloody period at the end of the family sentence. But the machinery of the Baekeland curse had not yet finished grinding the dynasty into dust. Justice for the wealthy is often a malleable concept, and for Anthony Baekeland, the consequences of matricide were mitigated by the very privilege that had driven him insane. Instead of a life sentence in a bleak prison cell, the heir to the plastic fortune was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Berkshire, England. While Broadmoor houses the most dangerous offenders in Britain, for Tony, it became a strange sort of sanctuary. Behind the high walls and Victorian brickwork, the prince was finally safe from the chaotic demands of his mother. He was medicated, fed, and stripped of the burden of choice. For 8 years, he existed in a chemical twilight, a ghost haunting the corridors of the asylum, writing disjointed letters and painting disturbing images that hinted at a mind permanently fractured by guilt and relief. However, the mechanism of the tragedy required one last act to complete the cycle. The legal and medical systems, perhaps swayed by the influence of the family name or simply demonstrating a catastrophic lapse in judgment, decided that Tony was cured. It is a decision that forensic historians still struggle to comprehend. How does one cure a man who stabbed his mother to death and then ordered Chinese food? The psychiatrists argued that his schizophrenia was manageable, that the murder was a situational event triggered by his specific relationship with Barbara. They believed that with Barbara dead, the trigger was gone. On July 21, 1980, Anthony Baekeland was released. He was 34 years old. He stepped out of Broadmoor not into a world of rehabilitation, but into a vacuum. He was deported back to the United States, the country his grandfather Leo had adopted to build his empire. Tony arrived in New York City, the glittering metropolis where his parents had once reigned as the golden couple of the jet set. But the city had changed. It was no longer the elegant playground of the 1950s. It was the gritty, dangerous New York of the early 80s. And Tony had changed too. He was no longer the angelic Petit prince with the Botticelli face. He was a bloated, trembling man with dead eyes, carrying the invisible weight of a matricide that everyone knew about, but no one wanted to mention. The tragedy now shifted to the Upper East Side, to the apartment of Nina Daly, Barbara's mother. Nina was 87 years old. She was a woman who had survived the suicide of her husband and the murder of her daughter. Now, in a twist of fate that defies all survival instincts, she opened her door to the man who had killed that daughter. Why did she do it? Perhaps it was a grandmother's blind love. Perhaps it was the Baekeland denial, the refusal to believe that their blood could be truly evil. Or perhaps, as some darker theories suggest, she simply had no one else. The family had been whittled down to these two survivors, the old woman and the broken grandson, bound together by a legacy of violence. Tony moved into her apartment. For 6 days there was a semblance of normalcy, but the bad seed theory was about to be proven right. The removal of Barbara had not removed the sickness. The sickness was inside Tony. It was woven into his neurons. Without the strict regimen of the hospital, without the walls to contain him, the paranoia returned with the force of a tsunami. On July 27, 1980, less than a week after his release, the mechanism triggered again. The details are eerily similar to the murder in London. A domestic setting, a female relative, a sudden explosion of psychotic rage. Tony attacked his grandmother. He lunged at Nina Daly with a kitchen knife, stabbing her repeatedly. The attack was a clumsy, desperate echo of the violence he had inflicted on his mother 8 years earlier. Nina, despite her age and frailty, fought back. She survived the assault, suffering broken bones and stab wounds, but the psychological blow was fatal. She had invited the monster into her home, believing he was a prince, and he had revealed his true face. This time, there was no Chinese food. There was no calm phone call. Tony was arrested immediately and thrown into the belly of the American penal system. He was sent to Rikers Island. Rikers Island is not Broadmoor. It is a brutal, chaotic jail complex sitting in the East River, a place of concrete, steel, and noise. There were no gardens here. There was no gentle therapy. For a man like Tony, raised on silk sheets, educated in Europe and fragile as glass, Rikers was hell on earth. He was thrown into the general population surrounded by hardened criminals who looked at the trust fund killer with predatory eyes. The isolation was absolute. His father, Brooks Baekeland, did not come to save him. Brooks was living his new life with Sylvie, having washed his hands of the son he had helped destroy. Tony was finally truly alone. The trial was set for March 1981. But Tony Baekeland had no intention of facing a judge. He had no intention of returning to a mental hospital. The clarity that often comes to schizophrenics in their darkest moments settled over him. He realized that the story was over. The voices in his head, the ghosts of his mother, the judgment of his father, the weight of the grandfather's legacy, it was all too heavy. He decided to exit the stage. The method of his suicide is the most chilling, symbolic detail in the entire history of the dynasty. It is a detail that no novelist would dare invent for fear of being too heavy-handed. Yet it is the forensic truth. On the morning of March 20th, 1981, guards at Rikers Island found Anthony Baekeland dead in his cell. He was found lying on his bunk, his body cold. He had suffocated himself. He had fashioned a crude mechanism of death using the only material available to him. He had found a plastic bag, perhaps a trash liner or a laundry bag, and pulled it over his head. He had tied it tight, cutting off the oxygen, inhaling his own carbon dioxide until the darkness took him. The irony is staggering. Leo Baekeland, the grandfather, had risen from poverty to become one of the wealthiest men in history by inventing synthetic plastic. He had ushered in the age of plastic, creating a material that defined the 20th century. Bakelite was the foundation of the family fortune. It was the source of the money that bought the villas, the champagne, the knives, and the madness. It was the substance that had paid for Tony's life of idle luxury. And in the end, it was a piece of plastic that Anthony Baekeland used to extinguish the bloodline. The empire that began with a chemical reaction in a laboratory in Yonkers ended with a chemical reaction in a pair of lungs in a jail cell. The material that Leo claimed had 1,000 uses found its final use as a weapon of self-destruction. The circle was closed. The serpent had eaten its own tail. With Tony's death, the direct line of the Baekeland Dynasty effectively collapsed. Brooks Baekeland lived on for decades, a ghost drifting through the world, writing poetry that no one read, and refusing to speak of the tragedy. He died in 2007, leaving behind no great legacy, only the scorched earth of his family history. Nina Daly died a few years after the attack, never recovering from the betrayal of her grandson. The forensic conclusion of the Baekeland dossier is a bleak testament to the corrosive power of unearned wealth and untreated trauma. The family had everything the American dream promises: genius, money, beauty, and freedom. But they lacked the structural integrity to support it. Like a piece of poorly cast Bakelite, they looked solid on the outside, but under pressure, they didn't bend. They shattered. Leo Baekeland once wrote, "I have tried to make my life a work of art." He succeeded only in making it a tragedy. His genius gave the world a material that lasts forever, but his family proved to be biodegradable, rotting away in the span of just 3 generations. Today, the name Baekeland is not remembered for the invention that changed the world, but for the pool of blood in London and the plastic bag in New York. It is a legacy of silence, broken only by the sound of a dynasty, suffocating in its own success.